Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at the Bloody Code, early modern punishments. Let's consider early prisons first. Jails and prisons had existed for a long time, often as a place to hold drunks and vagabonds temporarily. They were not a punishment in their own right, but a secure place to hold people awaiting trial and then a different punishment. Often a small cell by the town gatehouse or castle sufficed, or you might have a small lock-up in the village like you can see here. Conditions in jails were grim. Inmates had to pay guards for their food and basics. No pay? That meant you went without. Hardened violent offenders were housed with petty criminals. They could attack and abuse them, or lead them into more serious crime. Men, women and children were housed all together too, leaving many vulnerable. There was little sanitation. Diseases in the prisons were common. In the 1500s, the role of prisons began to change. In 1556, a new type of prison, or House of Correction, was opened at Bridewell Palace in London. It served a variety of functions, which to our modern eyes don't seem to go together very well. It housed the so-called idle poor, vagabonds who had broken the law too, and forced them to do work. It was also a place for orphaned children who were homeless, not that they were treated particularly sympathetically. The difference with Bridewell is that being sent to Bridewell was the punishment. To reinforce this, all inmates paid for their incarceration by doing hard labour as a part of their punishment. This might include stone breaking, oakum picking, which is picking apart old ropes, or other unskilled monotonous tasks. Stone breaking remained a role in prisons for a very long time. The photograph here shows Beaumaris Jail in North Wales. The basin that you can see has a tiny hole in the middle. Stones like the ones strewn to the right would have to be broken sufficiently small that they would fit as gravel down that little hole, so you can imagine it was pretty much back-breaking work. As it happens, I used to work at Beaumaris Jail, so I know this situation very well. Perhaps the most famous aspect of punishments at this time, though, was what was called the Bloody Code. In 1688, there was an increase in the number of crimes that carried the death penalty to 50. This was intended as a deterrent, and many of the crimes seem minor to modern sensibilities, including things like poaching rabbits and fish to eat, or some forms of petty theft. Modern historians call this harsh system the Bloody Code. It is now clear that it was ineffective as a deterrent. These are the reasons. The starving and desperate would not be deterred from crime. Their choice was between the certainty of starving to death weighed against the possibility of arrest and hanging. With that hanging over them, most people would turn to crime. Also, the sentences were not always carried out, and people knew this. The severity of the punishment made pardons for previous good character or other reasons quite common, making the Bloody Code inconsistent and unclear depending on who was judging the case. Also, women frequently would plead for the belly. If found to be pregnant, the sentence was to be carried out after the birth of the child. Typically, a pardon followed to allow the mother to care for the baby. And so the Bloody Code did not work as a deterrent, but still, lots of people went to the gallows for seemingly minor crimes. An alternative was desired. That alternative was soon found. During the reign of James I, a new punishment was introduced as an alternative for execution: transportation to the colonies. Initially, this meant a convict being sent to one of the North American colonies, but later in history, transportation to Australia was preferred. However, we're looking at the early modern period here, and so North American colonies is where people were sent. Those who would otherwise have been executed would have to do hard labour in the colony for 14 years, typically in agriculture or logging or something like that. Less serious offences carried a 7-year sentence. However, no money was provided for the return journey, so most stayed out there for life. Transportation was popular with the authorities for the following reasons. It was less severe than execution, but still an effective deterrent. There were no effective prisons in England at this time. The colonies were a so-called secure place to send people. They were unlikely to come back. Convicts provided much-needed manpower for the new colonies and helped them be set up. It was also hoped that transportation would give the possibility of rehabilitation for offenders, a very modern idea at the time. Perhaps they would go out there and make something of themselves and learn the error of their ways. It also offered a new start, far from criminal influences and away from the victims of their wrongdoing. This was particularly appealing as a sentence for young people. Essentially, go out to the colonies and make something of yourselves. But what were the effects of transportation? Eventually, around 50 to 80,000 people were transported to North America between the reign of James I in the early 1600s and American independence in 1776. Men, women and children were taken, though merchants preferred strong younger men as they made more useful labourers out in the colonies. There was also a system of so-called duty boys. Children could be sent from prisons like Bridewell to the colonies for a so-called fresh start, and also to free up some space. The homeless and vagrants might also be transported. They were sometimes blamed for spreading the plague, and transportation seemed like a solution to many of the so-called problems of the urban poor. The truth was that the transportation system was brutal. Many of the people transported died of disease on the journey, or died from the hardships of their work. We're going to take a moment to bring things together and consider the purpose of punishment over this period. We'll look first of all at an example of a crime. In this case, fraud, assault, not going to church, which was known as recusancy, and breaking legal contracts. Then we'll consider the punishments that were handed out. In these cases, fines of various sizes were very common. And then the purpose of that punishment. Fines were a deterrent, especially for the poor, and this reinforced the king's or queen's authority. What about begging and drunkenness? A typical punishment for this was the pillory or stocks. These had been used in earlier times, remember, and the purpose was deterrence through humiliation. What about for vagrancy, begging and theft, at least until the late 17th century? Well, this would involve whipping, branding and maiming. The purpose of this was deterrence and retribution through pain and injury. What about repeated begging, theft, and until the late 17th century at least, highway robbery, poaching, witchcraft, smuggling and murder? Well, for this, hanging, part of the bloody code, was the deterrent and the punishment. This was all about deterrence and retribution through public execution. The law was seen to be carried out in a very gruesome and dramatic way. Then there was treason. This would involve hanging, drawing and quartering. This was a deterrent and enforcing royal authority. What about heresy, crimes against the church? This only really counted in the 16th century though. Burning was usually the punishment for this. This was enforcing religious and royal authority, but it was also very gruesome and a deterrent in itself. And lastly, various other crimes from around the 17th century onwards might be punished by transportation. This was also a deterrence and retribution, but it removed people from society too. Let's sum up our final points. The early modern period saw a change in the way that prisons worked. Previously, they were holding areas for people awaiting trial. Starting in the 1500s, they became the punishment itself. Bridewell was a house of correction and early prison in London, opening in 1556. Its inmates were a mix of orphans, beggars and petty criminals who did hard labour as part of their sentence. Capital punishment, or the death penalty, expanded under the Bloody Code from 1688 onwards. However, deterrence wasn't effective. Transportation to the colonies was introduced as an alternative to capital punishment. From around 1600 to 1770, up to 80,000 convicts were transported to North America. The purpose of punishment remained a mix of deterrence, retribution and the enforcement of royal authority, with perhaps just a little bit of rehabilitation creeping into transportation. But that's us creeping towards the end of the video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. But for now, I'll say thanks very much and goodbye.